Hello, everyone. I'm Urshka Briznik, and thank you for joining this discussion organized by Real Utopia, a foundation for a participatory society. Hello to all the members of Real Utopia, all the ZNet friends, and everybody who is joining us today. This discussion on the Israel war on Gaza will be held by Steve Shalom, RU member, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at William Patterson University. He writes about US foreign policy and political vision. He's a member of Jewish Voices for Peace. And by Peter Bohmer. He was a professor of political economy at Evergreen State College in Olympia, activist since 1967 for radical change against war and in various solidarity movements, also for Palestine. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. Just short notices how this discussion will look like. So first, Peter and Steve will speak shortly and discuss the main topics that were also addressed in the announcement. So the political and economic conflict, the history of it, and how they today manifest themselves. They will talk about the Western government's response to the current war on Gaza, and they will also speak about repression on the West Bank. We will also discuss Israeli occupation, colonization of Palestine, the apartheid, and because after their short talks, you are all invited to comment, ask questions. The session is organized in a participatory way, so we would be happy if everybody who wants to will give their opinion, their comment, their thoughts about the ongoing war and occupation of Palestine. So after they will speak, you will be able to, as I said, ask questions or comment. And I would like you to maybe use the button at the bottom of your screen, the reaction button, and use the upheld hand, raise hand, if you want to speak. And I will then call on you. At the moment, you are all muted, but when I call on you, your microphone will be unmuted. Also, this session is being recorded because a lot of people have asked who could not come today if they can then receive the recording and listen to the session. So we have made that possible. Otherwise, we are here with people from various parts of the world. That's why we were using Universal Time Coordinated. So hopefully all those of you who are here did know when to join us. And okay, let's start. And I will first give the microphone to Steve. Please, Steve.
Thanks, Urshka. Thanks for organizing this session. I'd like to begin by quoting some remarks made by Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, a week and a half ago. He said, "I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented 7 October acts of terror by Hamas in Israel. It is also important to recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their lands steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economies stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people." So that's what the Secretary General said. The Israeli ambassador immediately replied. He called this a blood libel and demanded the immediate resignation of the UN Secretary General. But in fact, Guterres' position is exactly right. We oppose attacks on civilians, but not just Israeli civilians, Palestinian civilians too. And what happened on October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. So what is the context for October 7th? The UN warned a decade ago that Gaza would become unlivable by 2020. In 2021, 50% of Gaza's population said they didn't have enough food. In 2023, just before October 7th, it was 75% who said they didn't have enough food. On the West Bank, in the meantime, Israel has been gradually, but slowly but surely, taking over more and more land, dispossessing and attacking Palestinians. Their hopes for a decent future are becoming more and more remote. Now, we actually need to go back further. We need to go back to 1948. At that time, the Palestinian population of Palestine was 2/3 of the total population. And they were told they needed to be squeezed into 45% of the territory, allowing 55% of the territory to the 1/3 of the population that was Jewish. After a war, Israel expanded from that 55% to 78% of the territory. And Palestinians got nothing. The rest was divided between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. Some 750,000 Palestinians who found themselves within Israel's new borders were driven out of their homes in a massive ethnic cleansing and became refugees. Today, nearly 80% of the Palestinians who are squeezed into that narrow sliver of territory called Gaza are refugees or descendants of refugees from that initial ethnic cleansing. In 1967, Israel then took over all of the original Palestine. They took what Egypt had occupied, they took what Jordan had occupied. And what that meant is that since that time, Palestinians are essentially Israeli colonial subjects. Now, Israel withdrew its forces from Gaza in 2005, and some Israeli apologists like to say, okay, so we gave them all they wanted, and now they're ungrateful. But in fact, the occupation continues, and that's the opinion of every human rights organization and of the United Nations. The reason the occupation continues is because the people of Gaza do not control their own fate. They cannot import or export without Israeli permission. Now, you might say, well, Israel doesn't have to allow them to transfer goods across the Israeli border. No, but they have a coast. And Israel has basically said, you cannot build ports. If you try to build an airport, we will bomb it. You are under our control. When a ship of when ships of a flotilla of ships came in 2010 to deliver humanitarian aid, Israel attacked them. This is territory that remains under Israeli occupation. And the condition of the people has grown more and more desperate. In 2018, Palestinians marched to the fence that Israel puts encircling Gaza, marched to the fence and demanded justice. Israel killed about 200 people who constituted no threat to human life. This has been the response of Israel to every kind of attempt to secure justice for Palestinians. Every so often, Israel attacks Gaza. And Israel says, we are acting in self-defense because some rockets or whatever may have come from Gaza. But here's the thing. International law and common morality gives the right of self-defense to people who are attacked, but not if you are in the process of conducting an illegal occupation or some illegal activity. So, an example, a bank robber goes into the bank. Someone shoots at the bank robber. That bank robber is not entitled to the right of self-defense. Why? Because he's engaged in an illegal action. Likewise, if Israel doesn't want to be attacked, there's a very simple solution that doesn't require bombing Gaza. The simple solution is end the occupation. That's the way you respond to occupations. Now, the right of self-defense is not unlimited. International law specifies two important limitations on the right of self-defense. One of them is that the right of self-defense must be proportionate. Meaning, if there is some action that takes place that justifies self-defense, the act of self-defense cannot be unlimited in scope. Okay. So even if there were no explanation, no background, nothing accounting for Hamas's horrific actions on October 7th, that could not justify Israel's response, which is killing thousands of civilians and which threatens to kill many, many hundreds of thousands of civilians. Remember, you've got 2 million people in this narrow territory in which water, food, medical supplies, fuel have been cut off. Some truckloads have been allowed in of humanitarian aid, but a tiny trickle compared to what is needed. And humanitarian aid workers all say this is a desperate situation. Already, surgeries are being done without anesthesia. Pregnant women are drinking polluted water because there's no clean water. This is a humanitarian crisis of the first order. And that's why our demand is very clear. We need to have an immediate ceasefire and end of the siege in Gaza. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve. Now, Peter, yeah.
Thanks, Urska. Thanks and other people helping organize this, and welcome everybody on this very rainy Saturday morning in Olympia, Washington, where I am now, and about to go to, I think, a large demonstration that are happening all over the country today in Olympia in a few hours. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise like 11 points of questions from a talk I gave in Olympia on the 17th, and I expanded. Urska, you're going to put it in the chat, right? I'm not going to read the talk, but people can maybe look at it later. So these are all points pretty much in order from the chat, and I hope they really lead to discussion. I try to pick points that might be a little bit controversial, but I hope we can have a really rich discussion. We have a lot of people here, but I hope there's some good discussion or even comments or questions like Urska said. So let me start with the points. I'll put these in the chat later, but not now. Okay, and I'm following the order of my talk. The first point is anti-Semitism does continue today, stronger in Europe than the US. In the US, it has declined, but it's no longer institutionalized the way it was in the past. And I would argue further, Islamophobia, certainly, in the 21st century, is stronger than anti-Semitism. Okay, so I think that's important in talking. Two, when you take somebody's land, like the US did of native people here, that Israel did of Palestinians, all kind of settler colonial societies, they often make the argument, oh, no people were there. Israel says that they didn't develop it, but it always, the oppressive, the dominating power they justify their taking of land, and we see it, Palestinians are treated as less than equal within the Green Line, the 48 borders that Israel imposed, and less than human on the West Bank and Gaza. Okay. Thirdly, to me, Zionism is inherently unjust. And by Zionism, I mean a Jewish-dominated state where Jewish people have more rights than others, and also the right of return, right? People who are Jewish from all over the world can return to Israel. Palestinians who were expelled in 48 and some more in 67 and continuing today, they cannot return. So again, your thoughts on this idea of Zionism is inherently unjust. And I would say probably even racist. Okay, fourth point is anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic. Okay, there's a significant difference. The strategy of Israel, of Jewish Zionist groups like the Anti-Defamation League, AIPAC, they call it such. Don't fall for the strategy of anti-Semitism. When you say anti-Zionist, don't fall for the strategy, although challenge anti-Semitism. Moreover, contextualizing October 7th or Hamas is not anti-Semitic. I would also argue, and this is maybe more controversial, that not criticizing Hamas attack is not anti-Semitic. You may disagree with it, but it doesn't to me be anti-Semitic. Okay, fifth point, there's been a big debate for a long time within the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, in the larger community globally. Should there be just one state, Palestine, Israel for everybody who lives there, or two states, Palestine and Israel? And to me, what's central is that there's economic political justice and equality for all, especially because of the oppression, but not limit the Palestinians. I would add to this, and we can discuss this. This includes the right of Palestinians to return to inside the 48 borders that Israel imposed. Maybe not the same house, but that the right to return, which Israel has denied, was a basic fundamental human right. Israel has constantly been rejectionist, has never really considered either one of these, no matter what they claim, including the Oslo Accords. And there are groups, for example, a group that I've had some contact with, the Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine. They have made it very explicit that Palestine should consist of all the people there in a democratic, pro-socialist state. And they've made a decision many years ago not to attack civilians within the Green Line. They're an armed, group, been involved in a lot of attacks, but not to attack civilians within the Green Line, as similar to what the ANC, the African National Congress, did in the struggle against apartheid. My own thought, all of these seem really hard, is maybe two states to begin with Jewish people having to leave the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and also the right of return, but moving toward one state. Okay, sixth point, and Steve already kind of referred to this. History didn't start October 7th. The Balfour Declaration, I'd add to what Steve said, 1917, when Britain, an imperialist and anti-Semitic power, said, Jewish people in Palestine. 1948, Steve mentioned the Nakba, the expelling of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians inside the Green Line. 67, when Israel seized more. So it's true that Jewish people have lived there since Roman times, but a small part of the population. Before the Balfour Declaration, 1920s, it was about 7% of the population who I think lived pretty much, cooperatively with just another cultural religious group. But one point I did make in my talk is it's somewhat different. I mean, Israel is a settler colonialist state, so it's not different from the point of view of the victims, the Palestinians. But the thing of Jewish people, particularly Jewish people who went there in the 30s and 40s, like my grandparents, who then returned back to Vienna after World War II, countries like the US, Australia, Canada, limited immigration, which I think, so they bear some responsibility for the growth of the Jewish population in Palestine. And there's a really excellent series I mentioned, I don't usually like him, by Ken Burns, The U.S. and the Holocaust, which shows the U.S. limiting of people too. So this doesn't justify the oppression, dispossession of Palestinians, but I think it makes us slightly different from some other settler colonial states. Okay, a few more points and then I'll stop. So I think it's to understand, but not support the actions of October 7th by Hamas, where the majority of people who were killed in southern Israel were civilians. My thinking is they want to show to the world that Israel cannot continue this expansion of settlements on the West Bank, desecration of holy sites, the open-air prison of Gaza. There is a possibility, I think, of a negotiated settlement, including with Hamas, even though Hamas hasn't said explicitly Jewish people have a right to stay there, but they're not going to disarm. And this comes from a friend of mine in Portland who was involved, he was a Marine in the Tet Offensive, and he was saying the Tet Offensive in 1968, there was a huge uprising all over Vietnam by the NLF, the North Vietnamese. They even seized the U.S. Embassy for a while. And a lot of people argue it was a military defeat because thousands were killed. But, becoming really active at that time, the anti-war movement, all of a sudden, when people saw the U.S. had lied to them, the government, and they couldn't win, there was a real openness to discussing the war. And maybe this uprising, even with horrible, cost to the Palestinians, will lead to people reconsidering this continued oppression of Palestinians. So that's, to me, a hope. The U.S. support for Israel has been consistent since the 1967 war, and partly because Israel has been a reliable ally of the United States, including, supporting even governments that are anti-Semitic, that were like in the 70s and 80s that were so-called anti-communist. And one observation that I've shared with a few people here, it's not mine alone, the Biden total support for Israel, it may cost him the election in 2024. Kind of lost some Arab Americans, young people, Muslims. I know it's getting harder and harder for me to say, in states that are close, you should vote for them as the lesser two evils when this war is just so horrific. Okay, so what's to be done? Point 9. I think the protest and opposition to Israel is impressive and growing. And, it's clearly not enough, but it's significant and continuing. I don't know about protests in Israel. I'd love to hear if people know more about that by either Jewish or Palestinian people. Minimally call for ceasefire and end of siege as a starting point, as Steve mentioned. I think we should also target corporations such as Boeing around here, Raytheon, which I know people challenged in Arizona. We need to educate people, as a lot of people just don't even know what's going on, demonstrate direct action, developing a multi-generational, multiracial ongoing campaign, and of course support those being repressed. I think because of the movement globally, including the United States, the Biden administration has finally called for a pause, which is a little bit, Israel's rejected it so far, but of course, let's demand a lot more than that. 10, a common argument I hear is that it's too complicated. The two equal victims, and a person named Khalid Hamideh, who was one of the LA 8, people close to the PFLP, the Palestine Front for Liberation of Palestine, when he spoke in Olympia a while ago, people asked him what I just said, and his answer was, Palestinians are losing their land and their lives. Israeli Jews are losing their humanities. I thought that was a very profound point. Palestinians are losing their land, their lives. Israeli Jews are losing their humanities. And finally, the issue about does Israel policy, is it security for Jews? I mean, Netanyahu supposedly, you need this Jewish state to protect Jewish people. $3.8 billion from the U.S., another $14 billion is going to go, a totally militarized society. And even if Israel destroys Hamas, oppression breeds resistance, and Israel will eventually be defeated and destroyed if it continues along its current path. What's really upset me, in the last 3 weeks is to call Israel's genocidal activities self-defense is, to me, obscene. And, Blinken and Biden, they've used the same language. For moral and political reasons, the security of Jewish people and Palestinian people require the end of Israeli occupation, the end of U.S. support for Israel, and justice for all Palestinians. Moreover, the security state, Israeli policy and society moves Israelis further to right. Jewish people had a history of being on the side of other oppressed people and for liberation, seeing the ending oppression of Jews requires the liberation of all, but this policy of Israel continually, since 48, has moved Israelis further and further to right, less and less about humanity and equality. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope these 11 points will further some really good discussion. Okay, Urs, gets back to you.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
So now it's the time where you can ask questions or share your comments. It would be best if you can do it raising your hand with the reaction button at the bottom of your screen, because it's easier to communicate than posting your questions or comments in the chat. However, if you don't feel comfortable speaking, then of course we can. But we have our first hand raised, and it's Marsha. Marsha, go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful discussion. I have a number of questions and comments, but I'll start with the first one, which is that Israel has this amazing Mossad, and I am just, and defense forces, and I'm just amazed that they weren't there, like almost right at the beginning of October 7th, because the people who were murdered and taken hostage in the kibbutz that was attacked were mostly left-wing Israelis who were in favor of Palestinian rights. So the fact that this one was targeted and that the Israeli Defense Forces were nowhere to be seen is very puzzling, and it brings back what happened with Pearl Harbor, and that this would start, like, most people being in favor of Israel's defense and attack on the Palestinians. So I was just wondering if you would comment on that.
Yeah, I'll just say a quick word about that. I don't think that the Israeli government said, okay, let's hope we can aim Hamas's attack to the left wing or pro-peace kibbutzim. If they were going to do that, they also gave up a bunch of army bases as well in the process. But the more general way in which that's true, your statement is true, is that the Israeli Defense Forces were very much weakened around the Gaza border so that they could support the pogroms taking place by the armed settlers on the West Bank. So that's where Netanyahu and his really fascist government, and I'm not using that as a slur term, but there are literal fascists in his government. That's where the Netanyahu government thought Israeli forces were needed, on the West Bank, so we can seize more and more Palestinian land.
I'll just add one quick thing, Marsha. So I wouldn't call those kibbutzes leftist or pro-Palestinian. I mean, one of the problems kibbutzes, a lot of really interesting ideas, but they've always excluded Palestinians. And at least from and I don't support the attack on the kibbutzes, by the way, but I do think to call them leftist or pro-Palestinian is an exaggeration. in the sense of Palestinians having full equality with Jewish people.
Thank you. Any questions, comments? Otherwise, I have a question. Oh, okay, Tiago, go ahead. Yeah, I hope I pronounced that right.
Hi. Yes, it was right. Mike, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, sorry. My question is along the BDS, as you mentioned. According to what I know, there is some division on the tactics of it. And my question is, if the tactics of, as some are pro to do BDS on the occupied territories only, if that tactic has changed now that we have seen the Israeli state change to an approach of, ethnic cleansing, if the BDS should be broadened up as other people thought about, to the whole Israeli state. Thank you.
Steve, do you want to go first?
Whichever.
Well, go ahead. I'll go after you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the official BDS call by various Palestinian civil society groups back in 2005 called for BDS across the board, that is focused on within the Green Line, the 1967 borders, and in the occupied territories. Okay, various human rights groups over the years have shown that it's very hard to separate out the occupied territories from within the Green Line. For example, if you want to sanction the actions of the Israeli military for things it's doing, well, that takes place both in the occupied territories and wherever the Israeli military is. The Israeli government is the government of the whole territory. If you object, if you object to what China is doing to its Uyghur minority, you might want sanction just in that province, okay? But you might feel less inclined to support the Chinese government altogether. If Sudan was committing atrocities in Darfur, you might not say, I will not buy products from Darfur. I will try to boycott all Sudanese products. So it was always tough to focus your BDS activities just in the occupied territories. Some people argued that we ought to only focus on the occupied territories as a way to show that that's our real political objection. Peter Beinart, when he was much more pro-Zionist, he's moved on this, but he originally said we should support a boycott of the occupied territories, and we should buy an extra boost of products from Israel proper to show that we don't mind Israel, we just don't like the occupied territories. But the banks that are investing, the Israeli banks that are funding the occupation, are located inside the Green Line. And so again, it was always a murky position to try to do that.
2 points. Well, first, when Steve's referring to the Green Line, it's what Israel seized in 48 that Steve mentioned in introduction, not 67. It's the 48 borders.
No, it's the borders from 48 until June 6th, 67.
Okay. Right. Okay, good.
Okay.
I'm just trying to make clear what you were saying. Okay,
Yeah.
So 2 points. One, within BDS, they don't take position on one state or 2 states. One state meaning a state for all the people in that area. 2 states would be like Israel, and Palestine. It could be confederated, but anyway, they don't take a position that. And my point was in my questions, I think, one state can be incredibly unequal. Like look at South Africa today, it's one state, but it's incredible economic inequality between the African population, the Black African population, and people of European descent. And two states can, probably makes less sense economically, but can also, be totally unequal. So my point was the key issue is equality, economic equality and social equality, whether it's one state or two state. And Israel clearly is occupying, and the Jews occupying the whole area. Second point, so with BDS, it was in Olympia, our food co-op was the first one in the country to vote for it, and it was very controversial, but it has led to a lot of education. I think that in terms of both now, I thought this for many years, it seems to me a really important demand would be to not just oppose the $14 billion that's about to pass Congress with very little opposition, that additional military aid to Israel, but also the $3.8 billion that goes every year, the U.S. sending, troops to the Mediterranean, aircraft carriers, that Israel is still so dependent on U.S. support. I think trying to stop that is a really, really important demand.
Thank you. Ty Saxon.
Thank you so much. My question is I'm just kind of curious to hear people's thoughts, like strategically, like what can we do to stop the killing is like kind of as soon as possible, especially for those of us who are in the US right now. Because like you mentioned, obviously, like our government is playing a huge role in supporting this. So I teach at Bellevue College in the Seattle area, and we're talking about, we're working on setting up a teach-in at my school, and just, partly to give people some background on what's going on and what's been going on, but also like actions people can take. And so I know, like Peter mentioned, there's a big march in Olympia today. There's, marches and actions all over the US today, which is great. There was an action downtown Seattle at Senator Patty Murray's office. And I think she's one of our state senators here in Washington, and she's like on one of the committees for defense spending or something like that. But then there's also been talk about like what role could organized labor play, particularly in weapons manufacturers. Like Boeing has a huge presence here in the Seattle area. There's been suggestions of trying to have disruptions there. I know there's been disruptions not necessarily from organized labor, but disruptions at other weapons manufacturers like Raytheon in Arizona, and there was another one in Canada. I can't remember the name of it. And then I heard more recently there was an occupation of a ship in Oakland's port, I think, and which apparently is headed towards Tacoma up here in Washington State. I think possibly tomorrow. So I'm kind of curious what y'all think in terms of like, actions targeting people in Congress, representatives, or targeting weapons manufacturers, or should we do all of the above, or does it depend? And again, what does it mean if you're in the US versus elsewhere? Is it an all of the above strategy? What do y'all think on that? Thanks.
So, Oscar, this is okay. I think not just Steve and I should comment on some of these questions, but if other people would like to add, like to Ty's question, I think that'd be, is that okay? That just not just us. So it gets more kind of conversational. Just briefly, in terms of what the question, I think getting all of our institutions that we connected to, church groups, unions, community groups, other groups, to take stands against U.S. support for Israel. And I think again, the ceasefire and the stopping the siege, which Steve mentioned, and I think those are really important starting demands. But I think, that doesn't still get to the root of the problem. So going beyond that also, and just, briefly, like I've been impressed. I've lived in Olympia a long time, how in the last 2 weeks, people who have not been involved, have called me. How can they do something? They said, they haven't done anything for a while, but they just feel compelled to do stuff. And we're having a meeting on Monday in Olympia of just the people who want to get involved, who are not in movements. Because I think in many parts of the country, including here, there are many really progressive left people, but they're not in organizations. So trying to get people involved. So we're having a meeting to set up like people working like an art, a film series, music. I think we need so many different levels of struggle, and it's going to be a long thing. We're not going to have immediate victories, but I am impressed, particularly among young people, how much, opposition there is to, Israeli and U.S. propaganda and media propaganda.
I would just add that, there are always short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. I think getting to the root causes is an important thing to do, medium and long-term. I think short-term, there's a slaughter going on that we've got to try to stop as soon as we can. Polls show that a majority of Democrats want a ceasefire. Okay, so there's a very large public opinion that supports what we want in the immediate term. We've got to build on that. The fact that Biden announced, called for a pause. Okay, a pause is not adequate, but the fact that he changed his view and said that, though Israel is currently refusing, shows that public opinion matters. That is, public opinion helped along by large demonstrations in Grand Central Station, led by Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, Jewish groups. That really helps to mobilize opinion, and it makes it harder for politicians to take positions that are opposed to public opinion.
Marius?
Hello. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was slightly late to your discussion, and this may have already been raised. I joined it about 20 past. But here in the UK, the situation with our politicians is pretty depressing. I mean, there's very few parliamentarians who have dared raise their head above the parapet in calling for a ceasefire. If they do, in one case, speaking at a demonstration, they've kind of lost their jobs, or at least their party affiliation, official party affiliation. And what has struck me is that a few Israeli acquaintances have actually been considerably more critical, and historically, prior to this terrible series of events, of the situation in Israel and Britain's response to it. So arising from that, I'm just wondering, is there an opposition in Israel that is of any significance? I know, I'm very aware that there hasn't been one in recent decades that's really made an impact on these various rampages. But I'm just wondering if, when looking at the history of decolonization and so on, and attempts to move towards racial equality, whether it be in the US with slavery, in South Africa with British decolonization, it's usually taken some part of the governing class to realize the game is more or less up and actually, be willing to make concessions and so on. That doesn't really seem to be the case within Israel at present, albeit that there are, of course, Palestinian members of the Knesset and so on. So I'm just wondering if there's any prospect of meaningful opposition within Israel that might make a difference in this respect.
Thank you. So as Peter mentioned before, everyone who feels addressed can raise their hand and answer the question, not necessarily Peter and Steve. However, I follow the hands who have been raised first and then second and so on.
Yeah, but the Erska, I think the problem is that some people are raising their hands because they want to respond to the question that's just been posed, and some people have new questions, and you can't tell by looking at their hands which is which.
Right.
So maybe you need to say, everybody put your hand down for a minute, unless you want to address the question that was just asked. And then when there are no more of those, then ask people to put their hands back up again. I don't know.
We can try this, but this is Zoom for you. It complicates things, but yeah, we can try that. But for now, we have two questions up. Jones is up for a very long time now. But if you, Stephen, Peter, want to directly answer Marius, then go ahead. Otherwise, we'll go to John.
Well, the question inside Israel, including the Palestinian population, I'm really interested. I don't know much about it. So if anybody else here wanted to add to that, the question that was just asked, I'd appreciate that a lot.
Yes, I mean, just to put my question more briefly, is there a prospect of significant opposition within Israel making inroads and the necessary concessions for any change? Sorry,
there have been some little demonstrations in Israel, often led by families of the hostages. And so that may not be, the basis of a burgeoning left, but just people with a very, particular interest. But it does seem like Netanyahu's whole program, follow me and you'll all have security and happiness, has been exposed. And so it's hard to say. There are lots of people calling for Netanyahu's resignation, not because he's a war criminal, but will that political flux give an opening to left forces that have been quiescent for really for 20 years? It's hard to say.
Yeah, I just want to add to, in my talk, which was posted, I mentioned, there was some of the largest protests in Israeli history about the attempt by Netanyahu and the government to control the courts even more. But to me, those protests were always really limited because the issue of Palestine was not central, as Israel, both the government, the military, and the settlers increasing repression and expansion in the West Bank of land there, over, really major, like kind of vigilante, often getting guns from the government on the West Bank. And there was really no opposition to that. And again, this opposition, which is very strong, they've totally united with the Israeli government in terms of kind of the establishment. And, there was some request by a few of them, of some of the open fascists, and I don't use the word lightly either, in the Israeli government, like Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, be removed, but they've stayed in their position about head of security and finance. Ben-Gvir was convicted of terrorism, his connection to the Kach and Maya Kahani movement before. And so anyway, at least in terms of the Israeli establishment, it seems to me they're pretty united now in this. I guess I want to maybe raise just briefly, I saw a question from Robin Hanel about Sanders. And again, I'm interested in people's thoughts on that. Sanders, I think historically, while being good on some issues, has been very much of kind of a pro-Israeli Zionist in the past. He really changed in 2016, where he really began to be much more critical of Israel. But it seems since October 7th, I haven't read all of the speech, I skimmed it. even the call for ceasefire, which, Steve says an important demand. I think so also, even I think we should go beyond it too. He hasn't signed on to it. He's called for the pause, which is basically saying, pause at a few, some more supplies, which is good, and then, bomb and kill them like, unbelievably. And so he hasn't really gone beyond it. I don't really understand why he's been so horrible on this, but maybe the speech was better, but I don't think the concrete thing of calling for a ceasefire, unless he did it yesterday. I didn't see. I know some senators did. And as far as I know, he supports the additional military aid to Israel. So I'm not sure why, but if anybody had thoughts on that too.
Okay, John?
Thank you. I'm curious to ask the group, do people think that the current Israeli government is straightforwardly, its actions and its rhetoric can now reasonably and straightforwardly be called fascist? That's first question.
Okay.
Second question is, well, a statement. I can understand, given the historical context, why it has long been a taboo. And I think some Israelis have weaponized this taboo to not refer to Israeli atrocities, which would be straightforwardly called fascist in any other context, as fascist atrocities. Is it now the time to break that taboo and to say straightforwardly that Israel is a fascist government which is committing fascist atrocities? That's my second question. And the follow-up question would be, does this, well, I'm thinking particularly of the United States and the UK. When I say this, I'm a refugee from the UK, I'm living in Ireland now, that this represents a broader fascist turn. Because a lot of signs that I see, I think that not only has Israel been effectively taken over by fascists, but also that the West generally is drifting further and further towards the far right.
Thank you,
Steve,
John.
do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
Sure, you start.
Okay. Thanks for the question. So I think this movement to the right across Europe, United States, not all countries like it's not, I wouldn't say it's true in Latin America, for example, these days, but it is true. A lot of it is very much based on the anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim politics. So in the article I wrote, I call Israel's policy, I didn't use the word fascist, I used the word genocidal policies. And I did think, because I know the word genocide and fascist were both overused, but a really good legal group in the United States, the Center for Constitutional Rights, they have a paper, if you go to their website, Center for Constitutional Rights, on why what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocidal. And so I prefer using that. I mean, I would say really major fascist tendencies. And I said a few minutes ago, some of the ministers are clearly fascist. Yeah, I guess I'm hesitant still to use, I would say, authoritarian, militarist, racist, all of those, and with a lot of fascist tendencies. That's probably would be my answer. And thanks for the question. Steve?
Yeah, well, so Ben-Gvir, the cabinet member that Peter mentioned, used to have a picture up in his room of Baruch Goldstein. This is the guy who went into a mosque in 1994 and machine gunned a whole bunch of Palestinians. I mean, this was a mass murderer. These were not armed Palestinians; these were praying Palestinians, and this was his hero. But the question John, I assume your follow-up would be, okay, does one fascist a government make? Do two fascists a government make? Do members of the cabinet calling for a second, much more thorough Nakba? The Nakba was the driving out, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 1948. They're calling for a new one now, and more thorough. I don't know. I don't know what fascism means in a clear-cut way when you talk about the United States. We've had all kinds of debates over the years. Is Trump fascist? Was he proto-fascist? Was he enabling fascist? So I don't know. I don't take a firm stand on this question, but certainly there has been a strong rightward drift in many countries in Europe and in Israel. One just has to remember that Israel had a prime minister, Ariel Sharon, who since the early 1950s was engaged in war crimes against Palestinians. I mean, so much so that the Israeli government had to sort of cover it up and so on. He was doing raids and just wiping out villages. And Ariel Sharon became the Likud prime minister, the right-wing party, the party of the Irgun. These are the Zionist forces from pre-World War II who marched in and admired Mussolini's fascists, who Ben-Gurion called fascists. So Ariel Sharon is the prime minister. He then withdraws from Gaza, thinking, why should we be bogged down with having troops in Gaza when we can guard them from outside and concentrate on what we really want, which is the West Bank? And Netanyahu resigned from the government over that. He thought Ariel Sharon was a wimp. Okay. So there has been an incredible rightward move in Israeli politics over the years. The electoral left has disappeared over the years, but there are still lots of very brave and admirable individuals who are, some of them working in, B'Tselem, the human rights group, and many others. I call those people pro-Palestinian. Coming back, Peter, to the the residents of the kibbutz. The kibbutz as a whole is not pro-Palestinian, but I think there are, quite a number of peace activists who were present in those settings.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. Marsha?
Oh, Shangri-La had a hand up for a while, hadn't spoken yet. Mariska.
Okay, sorry.
Shangri-La, she's had her hand up for a while, hadn't spoken.
Yeah, I see, but I maybe Marsha can decide if she wants to go first because her hand was up first. But
Okay.
Shangri-La, okay.
Yes, I had several questions, but I'm going to go back to our political system here. And that is that it was proposed in an amendment, I guess, that $14 billion more should go to arm Israel. And there were 9 Democrats that voted against this, and their reelection is in jeopardy now. So as someone who has 13,000 relatives in Israel by marriage and over 100 by blood, and I'm Jewish, that I could be helpful by calling voters in these people's districts. It's Cori Bush, who's now being challenged by a Democrat, Jamal Bowman, AOC, and 6 others. So I think that it's possible to be helpful to help reelect them. But anyway, I just wanted your comments on that.
Yeah, well, 15 members of the House have supported a ceasefire resolution, while 423 supported a Stand with Israel resolution. The vote on the I'm not sure you're right about the vote on the 14 billion in the House, because the Democrats in general said we don't mind the 14 billion, but we mind that the Republicans added to the bill that the 14 billion would come out of funds that were going to the IRS, which means the Republicans wanted to give the rich the opportunity to cheat more on their taxes, and the Democrats, who had passed originally this bill for the IRS funding, would not accept that. Biden said he would veto it. So I don't think the Democrats as a whole voted for the 14 billion. But if it comes to them clean without, the IRS business, most of them likely will.
Yeah, I want to add much. So, it's so easy to be really depressed about this horrendous mass killing that's going on. And the Democratic Party historically has been as bad as the Republican Party. I do see something very positive in that there really is now, it's a very small number of Democrats, all Democrats of color, kind of, interesting, who really are challenging this kind of pro-Israel hegemony, this ridiculous thing of it's self-defense, what Israel's doing. So to me, people like Rashid Tlaib, and some of the people you mentioned, Ilhan Omar, others, some of the new Cesar, the congressperson from Austin. So I do think there really is this growing division within the Democratic Party. It's clearly not enough, but it is positive. And yes, there is going to be the opposition, AIPAC and some of these Zionist groups. They've already been very active in the last election of stopping progressive Democrats. So, you're calling, I think, supporting people who are under attack in Congress, in people's jobs, just like supporting political prisoners in the US, I think is really important in everything we do.
Shangri-La, Roshi or Yoshi, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, Shangri-La Joshi. I wanted to first thank both of the speakers, and especially thank Peter for pointing out two particular points. One, that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same, and so to make that distinction. And second point, that in the calls for decolonization of Palestine, I appreciated you pointing out that Israelis occupying that region are not the same as other settler colonials. So my questions are focused on the massive and growing Free Palestine movement, the social justice movement. On this, I wanted to ask if you think, if either of you or others think that in this growing movement, is there a sufficient enough understanding of this distinction? For instance, a lot of the messaging says that Israelis should cease to occupy and the place should be decolonized. So in this particular messaging, does there seem to be an understanding of the different kind of sort of dynamic that or set of circumstances that led Israelis to move to the region and settle there and to create a state? And secondly, do you see after October 7 in the burgeoning discourse among the social justice activist groups, are you concerned at all about a slide into more anti-Semitism and there to be a conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Okay, should I start this time, Steve? Is that okay? Are you?
Sure.
Okay. So, yeah, thanks for the questions. So first, I guess, even when I was saying it's different, I'm talking about people from Europe who went there in the 30s and 40s. Like, for example, the settlers who went to the West Bank and, the Gaza, even though, they left in 2005, and East Jerusalem. To me, they're just, I don't really have any sympathy for them. Even in any kind of middle run solution, I think those would have to be closed, given how little the land is for Palestine. But inside, I think there probably could be more understanding. I mean, I've thought a lot, like last Saturday, there was a pretty sizable demonstration in Seattle, maybe 2,500 people, calling for the end of the occupation. And the most common chant at the demonstration was, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." I'm sure a lot of people have heard that chant. It was by far the most common one. And it's somewhat ambiguous, right? When it says Palestine will be free, does it include Jewish people who live there? I think for many people there, it just says nobody should have special rights. It's for all people who live in the area, but it is ambiguous. Again, the mass media have called it anti-Semitic, and I don't think it is, but it is. There's some ambiguity. That's why, again, at least I stressed, like the DFLP, equality for all people. Hamas doesn't do that, but again, it seems to me if there were really negotiations about some kind of justice, self-determination, it could include Jewish people who live there too. I mean, Hamas, certainly they're not willing to give up being armed, and I don't think they should. So maybe there could be more, but I think the focus, understandably, is so much of what's happening to Palestinians. Steve, you gonna add?
Yeah, I had, as the question was being asked, I wrote notes and I wrote down the same slogan and was going to say the same thing. So I was quickly looking to see if I could find the article. On the website 972mag.com, which is a left-wing Israeli-Palestinian website. There's a very good article discussing this slogan. And the American Jewish Committee has said this shows how anti-Semitic everybody is for using that slogan. This article shows that there are lots of understandings of that slogan that says it's not just the Palestinians in the West Bank who need freedom. It's not just the Palestinians in Gaza who need freedom. It's not just the Palestinians in East Jerusalem who need freedom, but even the Palestinians within the Green Line, they too are second or third or fourth or fifth class citizens, and they need freedom too. So from the river to the sea, in the whole of historic Palestine, Palestinians deserve freedom. But that all said, because not everybody understands exactly what it means, I prefer not to use that slogan. I don't walk away from a demonstration where others are saying it, but I think it's probably not politically wise to use it, because you don't have time to give a full political analysis and explanation of what you mean.
I had my hand raised up just for a second because I want to call upon if there are some people who are Palestinians or from the movements across the world for the rights of Palestinians. Please let your voices be heard. And also I had a similar question or just a comment, because there are so different demonstrations going on around the world. Some are for the ceasefire and others are to end the occupation. And I think these are quite different goals that we have in mind. So I keep thinking, what is the solution if we demand ceasefire, and what is the solution if we demand the end of the occupation? Because, you know, if the ceasefire, the goal is achieved, then I think the things can go on in political and economical sense the same way as they have been going on for decades. But if you demand end the occupation, it's completely different. So from where I am from, so here in Slovenia, there is a movement for the rights of Palestinians, and there was a demonstration, I think 2 weeks ago, in the capital Ljubljana that demanded the end of occupation, the end of apartheid, and the main slogan was from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And we are preparing a next demonstration in 2 weeks in Maribor here in Slovenia, and it will be again against occupation and against apartheid. I'm not familiar if the slogan here means it's considered anti-Semite. I wouldn't say in this part of the world, at least, or here in our country. And I think it's understood as so everyone should be free that lives in the area that was once Palestine. So yeah, that might be interesting to hear from people who are from different continents here or different countries. How is this considered in your country? And maybe my next question was also, if the attack of Hamas on the 7th of October didn't happen, would the world be talking about Palestine as it does now? Because probably not. But is it? So what was the attack of Hamas? What good did it bring? Let me phrase this question like this. Yeah, it's just for a discussion, not necessarily for Peter and Steve to answer, but if you want to, yeah.
Yeah, I would just quickly say the question sort of assumes there are two options. One is nothing happened. Two is the attack happened as it occurred on October 7th, right? But there are other things that could also have put Palestine on the map in people's minds without the downside. That is, just to take one simple example, let's say that Hamas did the same attack they did with all the clever planning and so on, but didn't attack the kibbutzim. They just attacked the military bases. Okay. That might have inspired people for the Palestinian cause without at the same time giving the right-wing government in Israel and the US government the public relations basis for carrying out the genocide that is now threatened in Gaza. So, in other words, I don't think we should just accept the two choices: kill a lot of civilians and get attention, or don't do anything. I think there are other options.
Yeah, I'd like to answer maybe the first question, one I hope other people do also, about the demand. So to me, it can be both calling to ceasefire and ending the siege and ending the occupation. I do feel people on, let's say, the left or Palestine solidarity people should make end the occupation central also, even though, you know, it's more of a, like Steve said, middle or long run demand. However, I guess I want to raise the following question. Even, okay, the word occupation is ambiguous too, okay? When we say occupation, everybody agrees, it seems to me, who talks about ending the Israeli occupation includes the West Bank, Gaza, even, and there it's not the occupation directly, but like Steve mentioned, the basically, total blockade, blocking of goods coming in and out, and East Jerusalem, which, Israel actually annexed, claims it's part of Israel. So those, I think, we all agree on. The issue is, does the word occupation include what I said inside the green line, inside the pre-67 borders of Israel? To a lot of people, it does mean yes. And, I would think yes, too, in terms of like Israeli dominance, the right of return only of Israelis. But the word occupation, it means different things to different people. So I just wanted to raise that to discussion, how people think about ending the occupation, what we mean by that.
I'm sorry, can I say a second thing?
Okay.
Which is, I think whenever you plan a demonstration, there's always a trade-off. How big, how many people can you get? How much support can you get versus how close are the demands to your ultimate demands? Okay, so end the occupation, that's nonsense. We should call for world socialism everywhere, right? The problem is, if we had that demonstration, there'd be 8 of us out there, and 1 or 2 of us would get tired, so maybe there'd be 6. Okay, but so the question is, if you can get a demonstration, a pro-Palestinian demonstration that says ceasefire and end the occupation, and it's almost the same size as you could get for a ceasefire demonstration, go for it. Okay, but if not, then you've got to make a careful calculation. Okay, I think my own sense is that while I support all those other demands, I think the situation is so urgent at the moment that the demand for end the ceasefire, lift the siege, can get us in the communities I'm aware of. So, Erska, I don't pretend to know, what the situation is in Slovenia or anywhere else. But here, I know that when you say to people, where babies are being bombed, that will get certain people out that wouldn't come out for an end the occupation, whether occupation was specified as the occupied territories or all of historic Palestine, etc.
Thank you. Debbie Caulfield.
Thank you, Erska. Thank you for hosting this afternoon. It's been really informative. I'll just put on my video here too. I live in Northern Ireland, and we're in now almost a post-conflict society, and we realize the important part that America has played in brokering some of that change and that peace. And it required so much goodwill and taking what we call in this part of the world the whataboutery out of it, the constant slanging back and forward between each other about the atrocities that had been committed, apparently in each of our names, whatever part of the sectarian divide there was in this post-colonial part of the world now. And it's really heartbreaking. I've wept tears, like this, the inhumanity of everything that's happening, and the geopolitical implications of it. It was awful here when bombs were being planted, people were being shot, but the scale of what's happening in Palestine now at the moment is terrifying, sitting, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from it. And it's, and there is, Erska, here I think further west in Europe, there is a fear that when you call for a ceasefire, that you're called anti-Semitic. Yes, that's very real, I think, in Britain. And it is very, very difficult to see a way out of it. But there is hope. I would say to Peter and Steve, there is hope. There is, people will come together. We've had a decade of centenaries, as we've called them here, and all across the island of Ireland, where we've tried to respectfully look at the unionist and the nationalist perspectives on this. We still have a sectarian divide. It still exists today. Our education system fails our children. Our children are still segregated from the age of 5. They go to different schools run by different religious groups. And that change has to happen. There's a move towards integrated education. But I feel really scared for what's happening in Palestine at the moment, and tearful, every day tearful about the children and people, men, women, and children who are just wanting to live their lives. And what you've got there is a warmonger. Benjamin, I don't care whether there's labels of fascism, he's a warmonger. He wants to stay in power. That's his purpose and his aim. He's managed to draw together a coalition now and to stay in power. It was likely he wouldn't have been there in a year's time. And where the humanity comes, and it will come back into it. And it's good to see all these people from all over the world. There is hope. There is hope, but it's really dangerous and such a serious situation, I think, for all of us. There's floods everywhere. There's, catastrophic weather events that are happening in your country, all across Europe. Here at the moment, we should be focusing on those things and how to live together peacefully. But it takes 100 years. It takes 100 years. We've been working at this for 100 years, and it's still not resolved, and children are still being segregated. That's sea change. It's happening, and it's good to see so many young people wanting that change. Anyway, but thank you for this forum this afternoon and this opportunity to hear so many different voices.
Deb, thank you very much
Debbie.
for your comments. I remember I was at Derry last July, and the first thing I saw when I entered Derry in Northern Ireland was the Free Palestine on the entrance sign. And I know Ireland, the whole country is very involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And is there activities now about, opposing what Israel's doing and supporting Palestine? Is much going on in Derry, Belfast, Dublin, or other places that you know of?
So Debbie or any other person from the north of Ireland present, or Ireland?
Okay. Yes, there is, Peter. There's lots of marches. There are lots of people coming together. People are inspecting. I have a young daughter. I'm a granny now, and that part of seeing my own young daughter and her activism and her partner's activism, we're looking at products and things like that and seeing very much, a forefront. There were things that happened here in Ireland, and particularly in Dublin. I remember the anti-apartheid movement and Dunn's stores and how they stood up against that in South Africa. And that's very much happening now. And it's, that change, and to see so many young people. What makes me worried is that we went on mass marches. Millions of people marched against the war in Iraq, and we're supposed to live in democracies, and our governments didn't listen to us. So, yes, and we just have to keep pushing back against that. We have to keep pushing back against the propaganda. I'm constantly writing emails to the BBC objecting to how they're characterizing this, how they're, asking questions of. There was an outrageous interview with the head of the Red Crescent, asking him how he was ensuring that fuel and supplies weren't getting to Hamas. They wouldn't ask that of the British Red Cross, but they're asking it of the Red Crescent. And there is that Islamophobia built into it. And of course, all the history over the last couple of years with Jeremy Corbyn and the saying that there was so much anti-Semitism in the left and the Labour Party, which I didn't agree with. I thought that's not the case. They're simply objecting to what the government of Israel is doing. And people often don't make that distinction between people who live there, people who are just getting on with their daily lives and may object to what their own government's doing. But you live where you live and you get on with your life as best as you can. And sometimes your government doesn't listen to you.
Could I pick up on another aspect of what Debbie said, which is that in these kinds of conflicts where you've got competing national movements, like in Ireland and like in Israel-Palestine, if your vision, as I hope all of ours is some kind of future where in Ireland, Protestants and Catholics, and in Palestine, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs can live together in peace and understanding. If that's your goal, then there are certain means that don't help you get there. Okay, so there are several problems with Hamas's activity on October 7th. Okay? One is, just as a basic moral principle, I don't think one should kill children, right? Kill civilians. But in addition, if your goal is to have Israelis and Palestinians come together and be willing to live together, then that is not what happened on October 7th doesn't help you build that. And now it might be that Hamas's vision and my vision are not the same. And because our visions are different for the future, therefore our strategies for getting there and the tactics that we think are appropriate differ as well. Okay. If your relatives have been blown up by a bomb put in a pub in Northern Ireland, it's hard to feel love for the other group. And the same thing is true in Palestine. And somebody asked, is there anti-Semitism? It would be incredible if Palestinians did not have a lot of anti-Semitism. They are being butchered by a country that calls itself the Jewish state. Okay, a lot of them slip into and think Jews equal Zionists. Okay, our goal has got to be to show them that there are other Jewish views that don't want to kill them, understand where their hatred comes from, but not to endorse that hatred, but rather to try to refocus it on where the real enemy is.
John, then Willie, and then Marsha. John, go ahead.
Yeah, in the context of an urban population of over 2 million that have had no fresh water supply for a number of weeks, no prospect of any in the future, I wanted to, which can only end surely one way and very quickly. I wanted to quickly read you a quote from an article by Chris Hedges, the title of which is Israel's Final Solution for the Palestinians. In the article, he says, it is a grave mistake not to take the blood-curdling calls for the wholesale eradication and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians seriously. This rhetoric is not hyperbolic, It is a literal prescription. My question is, are we taking the prospect of a contemporary Holocaust in Gaza seriously enough? Because I find a lot of the conversations I hear around it are echoes of conversations I've been hearing for years about Palestine. And for me, while still relevant, are not the conversation we should be having right now, not the primary conversation we should be having.
Yes. So it does. Yeah, thanks for your comments, John. And yeah, I do think it's a really major escalation of Israeli aggression, right? Certainly, they've been killing people both directly and indirectly for many, many years, right? And the indirectly stuff is, intensified now. I guess, and probably, I don't fully understand Israeli motives. I think the Hamas thing, again, like I was saying, understanding, I don't support the attacks either, but to me, they're, understandable. It doesn't mean I support them. I agree with a lot of what Steve was saying. But I think Israel, what is their motive? It does seem, it is like another Nakba, at least of, part of Gaza. And I think your comments, you're really strong ones, are really important. To me, a question is, and I think I feel what you're saying too, but it's so far away from what most people in the US said we're trying to reach. So how, I think it means like really being committed to try to stop this in whatever ways we can, but understanding most people aren't there and trying to reach them, and just our own anger, like you're saying, of another final solution is not enough.
Willie?
Hi. I just want to make a comment on that phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. If I can, I think it's a very negative type of thing, because that type of, I know it's ambiguous and that there's different interpretations of it, but in Israel, the interpretation is that there's no place for them, for the Israeli people, and that's very negative, and that's actually for them a justification for their actions, because they say that's the only solution. So there's that type of thing. What they should actually say is that it should be a fair division of like a sharing, like of the land, not like one taking everything and the other one. The projection should be that it should be fair. Like I'm from South Africa, and I know, like for example, when apartheid ended, if that time they said the talk point was power sharing, like not saying one taking all the power or the other one taking the power. If that was the slogan, it wouldn't have ended, because everybody, the white people would have said, no, you want all the power, there's no place for us. Or the black people would have said this, they want all the power. So the slogan was power sharing. So, and that, like it turned if it wasn't like that, the white people would have still been very militant and willing to fight to the death for, like, just not that it's justified anyway, but it's the same in Israel, like that type of slogan. And I've heard it a lot, that people say, like, yeah, I saw that slogan in the protest march, that it says from the pub. So it means actually they're just saying they want to get rid of us. So you can't give them that justification with that. That's all.
Okay, briefly.
Thank you, Willie.
Okay, I was going to say briefly on Willie, and I think Steve kind of referred to this earlier. It seems to me the more people in Israel who are Jewish really support equality of all people, real equality for Palestinians, including economic equality, which, both within the green line and without, the more support for some kind of solution that includes everybody there, right? And it seems to me that even a real two-state solution, Israel, none of the major parties have ever accepted that. So I hear what you're saying, and the ANC stuff was very, very impressive. But again, there doesn't seem to be yet the number of Israelis, certainly not the political parties, who really support self-determination, justice for all. I think that creates the conditions for what you're talking about. And again, like I know in the thing I wrote that was posted, I was saying the more we stand up, to oppose the occupation, to oppose these genocidal policies of Israel, the more we have the right to criticize Hamas. Just criticizing Hamas, we're just standing on the sidelines, to me, is complicity.
Marsha?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I just have a couple more comments. One is that Netanyahu would not be a leader today if it weren't for his brother being shot in Entebbe, which was like a lot of years ago. That put the name Netanyahu on the map. And I think that's what helped him become the leader in Israel. And it's just like, one bullet made all the difference. And then, there are other decisions that were made from 1948 earlier and then later that led to the Palestinians being chased away. I believe that, my relatives by marriage were there from 1795, so the end of the Ottoman Empire. And the Palestinians or the Arabs and the Jews were fine together. They helped each other farm because they have different times for their Shabbat. So it was a decision to make war on the new nation of Israel by these 5 countries. And I just think there were just bad decisions made over the decades that have led to this. But I want to say one more thing before I ask for comments, and that is that I'm in the hospital right now with my daughter. She was very sick. This was her 12th day in the hospital. And there were people from all over the world who were nurses and doctors coming to help her, from India, from Africa, from the Arab nations. Asifa was one of my favorite people. And they all helped her get better. And I just think that there is a way of making this happen. And I also had to look up the history of the Hatfields and the McCoys, and they were killing each other for 200 years. And I don't know why, but it was just a feud, and it was 200 years before they decided to shake hands and make peace. So I do have hope, but I don't know from where it's going to come. I'd like to have the comments now, please.
You want to go first this time?
Yeah, I don't have much to say beyond from the river to the sea, all people shall be free. That seems like a good slogan, but I also realize that it's not imminent. We've got an emergent crisis that needs to be addressed, but our goals should be kept in mind.
Yeah, and maybe adding, Marsha, so to me, you were saying about Netanyahu's brother being killed in Entebbe. I didn't know that. I mean, he's a total war criminal, right? And the cabinet people have around him, just racist, horrible, a lot of religious fundamentalists who's allied with. But I mean, I was thinking when you were talking, not just like people like Begin and Sharon, but also the Labor Party, people like Golda Meir, Diane, they all are rejectionists in the sense they never accepted any kind of view of Palestinian self-determination of Palestine equality. So yes, Netanyahu is bad, but I think it's much more that it's been consistent of Israeli policy of not, allowing real Palestinian self-determination. So it's a slight difference from what you're saying. And I don't know, I mean, I have hope still. It's a very hard situation. And like somebody mentioned, I think Debbie Caulfield, about, it's really a global crisis, the climate, which again, this war, the whole military stuff is exacerbating the climate crisis also. And it's important to make those connections. But again, if you lived in the United States in 1855, you wouldn't have believed slavery would end in 10 years. Racism didn't end, but slavery did. And I think there is this growing movement around the world that Palestinians are paying unbelievable costs for. But I think there is hope for change. And it was getting the end of apartheid that Willie mentioned, again, not ending racism and inequality in South Africa, but still, I don't think many people believe that would have happened, in 1984, when you begin to have these really big mass movements there and around the world.
Some people can seem not to be able to raise hand with the icon, so I will now call upon those people. So JT LaChapelle, please go ahead.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Okay, great. I'm walking down the street here. Hopefully there's some traffic and stuff. Hopefully it's not too loud. Right. Hang on a second here. So I'm an Evergreen student, an Evergreen grad, and I remember Bohmer and Michael Albert and Robin Hannell, and I remember that whole crew. I don't know if they remember me. This was a long time ago, about 20 years ago. And I'm trying to keep an open mind and understand your position here. And the way, if you look back and look at it historically, that is a Jewish area for thousands of years. It has been a Jewish Israelite. And if you go back into Canaan, the predecessors of the Israelites, that has been a Jewish area for so long. And I'm just struggling trying to understand how people. I understand the point of the ceasefire. Okay, we don't want war there. We want to stop killing people. But my question is, why are they there in the first place? And why aren't we spending our energy, instead of constantly trying to get these two groups to get along? It's obviously, to me, and this is what I'm trying to understand, how people cannot see this and support this. And I'm not a Zionist. I'm no Zionist. I'm no real supporter of the Jews. I don't care either way. But when I step back and try to look objectively at this from a historical standpoint and look at the history, people are always saying, oh, the Palestinians have been there for centuries. Well, the Jews have been there for thousands of years. And I'm trying to see, how people don't see that, and how they can not see that wouldn't it be better to spend our energies after the ceasefire, of course, stop the violence, stop the killing. But then after that, instead of trying to get these two groups to stay along in this and to get along in this area, why don't we find another place for the Palestinians? Let the Jews have it. For crying out loud. Help me understand this, please.
Steve, I've had it addressed before, so why don't you start and I'll go after you.
Look, if you go back far enough in human history, there were 3 or 4 Homo sapiens on the earth.
Oh,
and so
God.
Let him finish.
So the question is, in the last roughly 2,000 years, the majority of the population in Palestine has been non-Jewish. There've always been some Jews, but they were A, a very small minority of the population, and B, they were not Zionists in the sense of wanting a Jewish state. Okay. And so to say that people who, my grandfather looked across this border, looked across this fence, and that was his village that he was driven out of in 1948, to compare that to what happened 3,000 years ago, doesn't seem morally equivalent. And so I don't accept your sense of what history demands.
Okay, and just to add briefly, and I said it before, there was a small Jewish population in that area who, everything I've read and talked to people, lived cooperatively with Palestinians until the 20th century. And then the Balfour Declaration, which Britain declared in 17, about saying for Jewish people there, you began to have a growing Jewish population in the 20s and 30s and taking land of Palestinians. And moreover, the domination of the Jewish people over the Palestinians, I think, is something that is really wrong, not only what's happening now, but certainly what's happened for 75 years.
How's the food?
So anyway, it just
Okay.
seems to me that both people, but certainly Palestinians, if anything, have more of a right to be there because, you know, they've been the main population there. But again, what Steve and I have been saying, we're talking about, like Steve said, you know, Palestine for everyone.
First Willie and then Matisse.
I just want to ask JT, where is he staying? In the USA, or where is he staying? And if his argument is correct, then he should support the Native American people to get rid of the white settlers there, because, I mean, historically they've been there, but you can't do that. It's not fair. And most people, I mean, there happen to be a lot of white people, and the thing is, you just need fairness, you know. And the same in Palestine and Israel. You can't follow that argument. There happens to be children and Palestinians there, and there happen to be Israelis there, and you have to share it and be fair. There's no way you can justify what happened. You should do what's happening currently. And I mean, nobody wants to get rid of white Americans as well.
Thank you, Willie. Matisse.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is one of the reasons why the Israeli settler colonism is a little different, you know, than like colonism in, say, Australia or Northern America, you know, because before the settlers, there was, you know, no English there. So it started, you know, but in Israel or area of Palestine, you know, there were, of course, some Jews. But as it was said, you know, it was a very small minority, you know, in like at the time of Balfour Declaration, or even at before the UN suggested, you know, that the Israel should be created. They owned like 6% of the land in Palestine, you know. So they were a very, very small minority. And of course, you know, you can kind of say, you know, okay, but people have the right to self-determination, people's right, but of course you don't have the right to, no country has the right of self-determination in another people's territory, right? So this is complete nonsense. And also, you know, the way there's no such thing, you know, as a state that privileges, you know, a special ethnic or religious group. You know, like what you propose Israel should have, no other country in the world has. There is no other country in the world, you know, who says members of this ethnic or religious group, you know, have special legal rights, you know, and the others don't. And we should just take the lands of the people who are not of this ethnic group, you know. So I think, you know, part of why this is unjust is because we have to be, you know, equal in treatment of all people, right? So I think that's the big part of it, you know, why, you know, we shouldn't be supporting of, oh, well, let's just give, you know, not even Israelis, you know, let's give the Jews, you know, like a religious group, some other people's land, you know. I really don't see how this is just, you know, even if, you know, somewhere in history, you know, other Jews lived there. You know, I don't see how this is relevant. This is not how ownership of the land gets transferred. You know, some people who believed a certain precept on basis on some holy book lived somewhere, but because I believe the same thing of the same book, now I can take that land. You know, it's like this principle isn't applied in any other case, in the world, or actually maybe some people want to, but no one's ever recognized this sort of claim as legitimate or moral or whatnot, so I don't see why we should treat the wish for the Zionists, to have the Palestine, where they were a minority, differently than we would, claim of any other group, to have some land that, their thousands of years, their tribe kind of passed through or held, or maybe a minority of them lived there. So it makes no sense.
There was an old Zionist saying that went, Palestine is a land without people for a people without land. And there was a cultural Zionist, not a political Zionist, a cultural Zionist, Ahad Ha'am, who said, oh my God, I see that the land is not without people. And so that slogan of ours is unjust. And, that was, I think, a very valid observation. But that said, in the same way that I don't think, and as we've all said, that we're not calling for all Europeans to leave North America and go back to Europe, at one time, the Palestinian movement seemed to say any Jew who was here before 1917 can stay, but that position was transcended for an understanding of, no, we're not planning to drive anybody into the sea. And certainly our position as people with left values is one of rights for both peoples in that land.
So we are nearing a 2-hour mark. Tiago has his hand up, and then I will let Peter and Steve decide how long they want to continue. Tiago.
I want to bring up a few more things and also similarities to what I've been hearing. I'm Portuguese, so our past has some similarities with this. I mean, you look at the war that Portugal waged against its colonies in the 60s and 70s, and I see, I mean, from what I read, now I'm seeing it in real life, the dynamics between an occupying state and the indigenous people, and see the rhetoric from both sides. I mean, now for Portuguese, that's very clear what we were and what we were doing in terms of propaganda. There are some similarities because we had UN votes going on about these, condemning Portuguese role as a colonial settler country. So for me, it's very clear because I know my history to understand how much the rhetoric is being pushed to Israel's side. I have to say, and how much we as spectators or taking the side of the indigenous people are still being confused by this rhetoric from the propaganda side. So for me, it's very curious, but at the same time, it's hard to, when we have a slogan that I agree, I see the point, and I've talked with friends about it, that it's still confusing to some people what from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, but at the same time, I have a hard time recommending Palestinian friends to not say that, because I feel like me as a spectator, may be buying into too much into the colonial settler propaganda and not allowing the native people to advocate for something that was stolen. And I don't mean this as, you know, as a one state, a Palestinian one state. I don't mean to that extent, but, you know, reading also from Amilcar Cabral from Guinea, I'm not sure if he was giving up so much to the propaganda from the Portuguese state to not have such a strong stand on liberation. I know it's different case here because Portugal wasn't there, so there wasn't any argument that we should stay there. Once that collapsed, you know, we just leave, and that's what we did. You know, not willingly, you know, and so easily we left, but we did after years. So for me, understanding this, how much we should give up on the struggle for liberation, it's a hard topic for me, especially in the case. I mean, everyone makes comparisons to South Africa, but we are talking about the state that doesn't have much interest on the indigenous people. A bit different than the South African case, where a lot of the working people wasn't white. So the state needed the people much more than the Israel needs the Palestinians, especially in Gaza. They don't need it at all. They have stated that very well. The same was with the Portuguese state. The colony wouldn't work without the native people. So I don't know how to navigate in this dynamic. And one last thing I just want to bring up, which we did in the beginning, in terms of hope. I do wonder if you do have the same hope that I have, that this is the time to make broad coalitions, which I think are happening, and you can see the signatories of a few letters and movements joining to the marches. I do wonder if this is the time that we will see a broad coalition, you know, around the Palestinians. You know, I think it was Edward Said that said Americans won't be free, or Israelis won't be free until the Palestinians are free. That was the case for the Portuguese. Our dictatorship didn't end until the African colonies liberated from our control. So I do wonder if this coalition is gonna be brought up in a time that such a thing is really necessary. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So I just want to add to what you're saying. To me, what's really relevant, and I was very involved in the supporting Angola, Mozambique, and particularly Guinea-Bissau in the fight for independence. And one important part I just wanted to add to your thoughtful comments is that particularly in Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, when they captured Portuguese soldiers, they would say, you know, they wouldn't kill them, they would educate them, and many of them were involved in overthrowing basically the fascist dictatorship in Portugal. So I think that's also a very interesting and important lesson. To me, to call for one state, a Palestine state, I don't think that's, you know, pie in the sky. It's not something happening now, but it does seem a one state of all people there is something that is a long-run goal. And when you were saying, I guess two other brief comments, when you were saying like kind of standing on the sideline spectators, to me, the slogan, I know it's slogan, injury to one, injury to all. To me, the idea of kind of solidarity with people who are really unbelievably oppressed in a colonial situation, I think it's something that we all can feel too, not as directly, but to me, it seems central. And finally, of course, every country is different. Like you mentioned some difference with South Africa, and certainly you're right, Israel isn't exploiting the labor of Gaza directly. But to me, it's not that complicated. You were saying it's very complicated. I do think, and I'm not saying this of you specifically, people often say complicated as a way of not getting involved. I think, again, you know, Israel, for example, the thing with the bombing, you know, of the hospital, whether it was a Islamic Jihad mistake or Israel, I think they're very much into trying to create confusion, make seem people so complicated. This idea of an Israeli occupation and systemic displacement of Palestinians, forcing them out for 75 years or more, it doesn't seem that complicated to me.
Before Jonathan, there is Pat who wants to speak but can't raise their hand.
Am I unmuted?
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I have to preface what I want to say with, of course, the very urgent need to stop this war as soon as possible. But I also I'm from the United States, and I do not think that the United States has ever been an honest broker in peace between Israel and Palestine. It makes me think there were probably some very ulterior motives to move the Jewish people back there after World War II. And to me, I think that in order to make it more apparent for the American people and the government to realize, just saying we have to stop this war because they think, oh, Israel has the right to defend itself. But Israel, the government of Israel anyway, over the years, is the case of the abused becoming the abuser. And they use this also as justification of, oh, they are always so abused that they have to defend themselves. But if you have an abused person who becomes an abuser, you don't allow that to continue. You have to try to assist them in healing. We never have done that. And if it can be looked at that way, then they are committing war crimes just as war crimes were committed against them. And the U.S. is complicit in that action when we give military weapons to Israel.
Thank you.
Yeah. In 1948, the United States and other countries that supported the establishment of Israel, they were not moving Jews back there because most of the Jews who came there were Europeans. So although Zionist messaging likes to say this is the return of the Jewish people to Israel, no, this was a place for them to go after the horrors of the Holocaust. A key U.S. motive and a motive of most of the European countries was we bear terrible guilt and responsibility for what happened in the Holocaust because we would not let the Jews in before the war. And we continue to not want Jews here. And so here's a place for them to go. This will salve our conscience and avoid immigration problems that we don't want. So I think that was the explanation for U.S. policy at that time. After 1967, as Peter said, the United States became a major strategic ally of Israel, and then U.S. motives were rather different. It was to have a sort of a major military force in the region that could help tame it for Washington's interests. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Jonathan?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. I want to be brief. I've long been interested in the subject. I went to Evergreen. I was a friend of Rachel Corrie. I know Peter from a long time back. And my politics have shifted, gone different ways over the years. I studied Judaism intensively in France and became aware of the reality of anti-Semitism in a way that I had not been before when I lived there. living amongst Jews, attending a synagogue, I started to see the world very differently. And I've been watching the news and seeing reports of Jews saying that they feel scared, seeing the Israeli state, the nation, say, don't wear your yarmulke or signal anything if you're traveling to show people that you're in any way affiliated with the state of Israel, or that even that you're Jewish. I feel like there's a discounting of that among the left, of the reality of the fear. I feel like I think it's a form of oppression, which if any other group was to feel that way, it wouldn't be tolerated among leftists, but it's okay among Jews. And I think that the reason has to do with Jews being historic scapegoat going back millennia. And the anti-Semitism that served a function in the past is today serving a different function, but it's in some ways it's the same. Israel is very much a scapegoat for it's very convenient for all the activists to have their eyes on this one region of the world when there's so many other things going on, the Uyghurs in China, yada, 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 can go on forever. My question, though, to just form a question is, what is the point of the state of Israel? What do you think is the point of the state of Israel? Has it served? The German vice chairman, I believe it was, gave a very interesting speech a couple days ago talking about how Germany has a historic responsibility to protect Jews within Germany, and that they see the world very differently than everybody else in the United Nations, really, because of their history. But and that Israel came out of the Holocaust, and that Israel was created so that it would never happen again. So my question is, does Israel still really serve that function? Because this idea that there could be one nation state where, of course, Jews are going to be a minority and surrounded by Arab states that are hostile, and that's not going away anytime soon. They're going to cease to be a Jewish state. They're going to cease to have any way of protecting Jews anywhere in the world if there's not a Jewish state. Is it important to have a Jewish state? Is it important for there to be a state with the sole monopoly of legitimate use of power so that they can protect Jewish interests all over the world and within the state of Israel, or is it not important? That's my question.
I'm sorry. Hi, Jonathan. That's
Hi.
Peter. So I did say in my comments, I don't know if you were at the beginning, I think anti-Semitism is real and serious and worse in Europe, United States, but also, and you're right, there have been some attacks, and those we should definitely oppose. But anti-Islamophobia to me, is even more serious. It doesn't make anti-Semitism, unimportant. So it is real. But also my last point, which is directly, I think, to your question, does, a Jewish state does mean Jewish dominance, the way it's set up. For example, the whole thing, any Jewish person from around the world can move to Israel, while Palestinians who were kicked out, in 48 can't return. So to me, that's inherently unjust. And does it add to Jewish security? My point is, all these billions of dollars, all of the hostility Israel's creating by its policies doesn't add to Israeli security. Yes, they can maybe destroy Hamas, ethnic cleanse in Gaza, which they're doing, but that's going to increase hatred, and it doesn't lead to security of Jewish people. It seems that some way of really kind of equality, which I know isn't going to happen tomorrow either, is both morally just. It doesn't push Israel people to the right, and is more a possibility of security than consistently trying to oppress and dominate other people.
Yeah, I'd like to say that the scourge of anti-Semitism is reasserting its ugly head. Yeah. And as has generally been the case, Israel has not served to reduce global anti-Semitism. It was supposed to be the place for security for Jews, as Jonathan said, but in fact, it's done the opposite. I mean, think about the status of Jews in the United States over the last 100 years. There was all kinds of discrimination against Jews. Jews on the lease to your house, it said you cannot sell this to a Jew, right? There was all that kind of stuff, okay? And that's largely disappeared. And Jews have become more and more prominent in every different realm of American life. And the setbacks that we experience come when Israel is oppressing others. So this is the scary time for American Jews, not because of something that's happening to American Jews, but because of something Israel is doing. Now, let me be clear. Anti-Semitism is wrong, and it is wrong and unacceptable to blame Jews, the Jewish people, or any innocent and separate Jews for what the Israeli government or any individual Jews do. That is bigotry, and it's wrong. Okay, but the dynamic has been that oppression of Palestinians has led to all kinds of ways in which the Israeli state has gotten a deservedly bad reputation in the world. And that hasn't been good for the Jews. That's been bad for the Jews.
Makit?
Stephen Peter already mentioned a lot of things I was planning to say. But still, while we can see now, especially with what's going on, that there's a spike in anti-Semitism, and certainly that isn't helped by the by the case that State of Israel claims to stand for all the Jews in the world, right? Which is clearly not the case, but it's something that is repeated by the representatives of the Israeli state. And, some people take this seriously and start to believe it. And it's because Israel does manifestly unjust actions, so it serves as ammunition for racists, to actually, live out their racist fantasies, but I think generally I don't know about every society, but in Slovenia, racism towards Jews is probably quite low on the ladder, especially, like from a state level responses. I mean, just a little more than a week ago, like special SWAT team was called on a guy who, and he was kind of Arab looking, listening to Arab music, sitting in a car. He was doing nothing. He was just parked, sitting in a car, listening to music, and the SWAT team was called, to arrest him. So that's never happened to any Jew in Slovenia. So, but it's a response that regularly happens to other groups. Where they are being criminalized, for just going into a bar or something. So I think, we live in a society where, like, institutionally in the media or the, commentariat, are extremely, on one hand, extremely sensitive to everything that could in some way be understood as anti-Semitic, while on the other hand, when, say, President or Prime Minister of Israel claims that Israel, is a stand-in for the whole Jewish people all over the world, which is one of the definitions of anti-Semitism, right? So if you look at the definition that Israel wants the whole world to accept, they call as anti-Semitic the idea that, Jews are all equal with Israel, while they themselves push this So it's quite weird, when we're extremely sensitive to it. But in some cases, where it serves the state of Israel, we're not. We just ignore it. So it's a weird dynamic.
So I just want to add 2 quick points to what Matisse and Steve said. Yeah, Jonathan. So I think that anti-Semitism is increased by what Israel is doing, shows that there is anti-Semitism to begin with. Otherwise, people just say Israel is this, criminal state, So I think the U.S. is also. So you're right, it exists before, but it also seems, and I think Steve did mention this, groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, and I know they had some direct action yesterday in Seattle, and Steve mentioned Grand Central Station and protests in D.C. I think Jewish people standing up, like yesterday at a vigil in Olympia, a person who wore shirts that not in our name. I think it's so important that Jewish people are challenging what Israel is. Everybody, of course, should be, but I do think, and U.S. policy is also a way of, I think, challenging, anti-Semitism.
If I can just add one thing, so as not to leave a misimpression. There are other sources of anti-Semitism in the United States other than reaction to Israel, as Peter said, but I want to point particularly to right-wing anti-Semitism, like the shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue and so on. And this is part of the growth of right-wing movements and the growing strength of the far right in the United States. And that's something that needs to be opposed apart from anything having to do with the Middle East.
Okay, we should be slowly wrapping up. Peter suggested, however, there was a hand before up from Willie, and JT LaChapelle, who cannot raise his hand, asked for a comment, and then we have one more comment in the chat by Robin Haniel. So Willie, your hand is not raised up at the moment, but do you want to speak?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention about Israel that says they need security and a place for Jews to, but this type of action that they're doing is actually undermining their security in long term, because geographically Israel is very small, and if you look at the surrounding area, it's very big, and they're in conflict with that big area around them. Maybe they've got a lot of nuclear weapons and stuff, but I would give Israel 50 years with this type of behavior as maximum. But the only way actually security for them, if you look at the whole picture, is actually to get a fair deal with the Palestinians and say, you've got the port, you can connect the West Bank and Gaza and have a fair, livable space. I mean, in South Africa, once I was hitchhiking, and so a guy that picked me up was a general in the South African army. And he told me that they realized that they just can't continue their aggressive, expansionistic type of mentality. They need to do something else. And I think Israel, if they don't realize it soon, there won't be much security or long-term Israel. They've got no option. They have to, because there's fronts opening up against, like Syria now, Lebanon, and it's a dynamic place, the Middle East, and they need to change something.
Thank you, Willie. JT LaChapelle, would you want to respond?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wow. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Yeah, so I thought you guys were going to forget about me. I've kind of lost some momentum here. So there were 3 responses. You had Steve Shalom. What was he saying? He said he didn't buy my historical claim. Okay, well, I don't buy his historical claim, because what seems to be the problem here, it's about where you're drawing this line. Okay, that he's drawing this arbitrary line at 2,000 years. You can draw it at 500 years, okay, or 300 years. wherever it's most convenient. And it just seems like he's drawing a convenient line when, where you draw that line is really important. And ultimately, let's say I choose to draw the line, let's go back 3,000 years and let's look at the people who have been there the longest and who have shed the most blood and whose blood and tears and sweat is in the soil the most there. Who has the most blood and sweat and tears in that soil? And I think if we look back at the history of those people, it's going to be the Jewish people. And again, I'm no fan. I'm no Zionist. I'm no supporter. I'm not Jewish. But looking at it objectively, they've been there the longest. So that's my response to Steve. Peter Bohmer came and he said something. He responded saying that, he just wants them to get along, in the two-state solution or the one-state solution. I forgot what he said, but basically he's saying these two groups can get along in that area. No, they can't. It's clear that they can't. History has shown us that they can't. Okay, they're like cats and dogs. In fact, we don't have to use that analogy. We can use Arabs and Jews, okay, because, that's what we're talking about. They do not get along. They're not ever going to get along. So we need to quit wasting our energy on trying to get these two people to get along and figure out if my first claim is correct, that Jews do have a right to this land. What are we going to do with the Palestinians? That's a major, major question. That's what we should be addressing. What can we do with these 2 million or however many refugees that we're going to have? Where can be their home in the world? That's what I think we need to be addressing. And the third guy, I don't remember what his name was, the third speaker, mentioned Native Americans. And that's a very interesting point. Yeah, sure. If I'm going to go back and give historical claim to the Jews, I should do the same to the Native Americans. And I would. They were here first. Okay. But then I would also, and I have a unique history with this. My mom married a Quinault Indian. So I grew up with them. I grew up with the Quinault Indian tribe. Okay. So I have a unique perspective on this. I practically grew up on the reservation. Okay. So I have strong feelings about that. And what I would say is, yeah, if we could go back in time, or if we could somehow do that, I would give the Indians more land or their land back, but we can't. And another note on that is that, and what people fail to, I'm walking down the street here, so that's why I'm out of breath here. What people fail to acknowledge in that question when they're looking at, native rights and native land and the conquest and all of this, is that the natives were not a peaceful utopian group. Okay, by any means. Okay, they were savage competitors, constantly fighting with one another. Okay, and then the Europeans came along and they outcompeted them. Simply. So that's something that needs to be considered in the native question. We were better at it. Okay, so that's my answer to the third guy.
So, Peter or Willie?
Okay,
Peter,
I'll say quickly. I know we're probably running out of time. Yeah, I basically disagree in terms of people like being able to work together. You take southern Spain, the same year that Spain supported Columbus, doing his like mass murder colonization in the Western Hemisphere, Queen Isabella expelled, the Moors. They were Muslim, Jewish, Catholic people working together pretty cooperatively. And I also pointed out there were the Jewish people in what's Palestine, Israel, partly Israel today. It was like a religious difference. It wasn't like this hostility before you had the kind of growing population of Jews. And the main thing is the question of Jewish domination. That's what I've been criticizing. I'm not saying kumbaya. I think the Jewish domination, colonization must be ended. And that's what movements around the world are growingly calling for. And also, I think your history of Native people, you're making generalizations, which maybe, I don't think they apply to Europeans either, but, they just seem gross generalization. There's such difference among Native people in the Americas, and one size doesn't fit all.
Willie? Willie?
Okay, so sorry, I just wanted to quickly mention, JT mentioned that that they were more advanced technologically. That's why it justifies the colonization and taking over the land. So my neighbor They don't cut their grass, and the swimming pool is full of bugs and stuff. So I can invade there and take it over because I'll run it better. In that sense, I'll do it tomorrow. I'm gonna invade the neighbor, take over. I'm sure I can run their house better.
Thank you, Willie. Martha? Marsha?
Hi. So I just wanted to tell you about my experience when I was in Israel in 1975, 76. And that is that I went to a Christian Palestinian enclave to teach somebody's son the cello. And it was a very, very wealthy neighborhood. And I'm wondering how much of this is a problem of wealth inequality, so that the Palestinians with a lot of money are treated well and they have the right to vote and, you know, give their kids cello lessons. And then the people in Gaza Strip who are basically being, you know, bombed. So yeah, I think that's, and also is it a question of the Palestinians being Christian? So it is a religious thing, a wealth thing. Could you comment on that? And also, I'm sort of in and out because I'm still at the hospital, but I would appreciate comments. Thank you.
Peter, Steve, and I suggest then we wrap things up.
So this is the last question. Okay, so at one
Oh, you
time,
have one more from Rob. Sorry, you have one more from Robin Hanel in the chat.
okay, so at one time about a third of Palestinians were Christian. That has changed over time, in part because, yes, Christian Palestinians were generally economically better off. Better off people tend to have smaller families. And so, as takes place all over the world, the poorer group expanded at a greater rate. Also because they were better off, they were more able to get themselves out or to secure their position. So, you know, there is that dynamic, but the underlying oppression applies to both Christian and Muslim Palestinians. Some of the most courageous nonviolent campaigners against the Israeli occupation took place in various Christian Palestinian villages. All of them don't have the right to return to their homes. So the oppression is not a class-based oppression. It is a national ethnic oppression.
Peter, your microphone is off.
I kind of, okay. Yeah. Marsh, it seems to me so central is the issue of land, you know, Palestinians being dispossessed in the land, not being able to return. It seems to me the dispossession and the taking of land, growing settlements on the West Bank are really central to what's been going on. You want to do Robin's question and call? Should we do?
Yes, let's do Robin's question, and then we are wrapping up. So the question is, why isn't the right demand for a U.S. movement on this subject that the Biden administration withdraw U.S. military and economic aid to Israel if the Israeli government goes ahead with the military operation I believe we are about to see occur?
Before October 7th, I was carrying around signs that say end Israeli apartheid. The other one said end U.S. military aid to Israel. Those are standard important demands, and they continue to be standard important demands. The question is whether you want, new U.S. weapons are not going to be integrated into the Israeli military in time to carry out the current slaughter. So that's why I would focus on the ceasefire. But lots of people are saying also, vote no on the military aid, on this, $14 billion package. And, I agree with that too.
Nothing to add, Greg. Yeah, nothing to really add.
Okay. Then I suggest we conclude this session. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you, Steve and Peter. And I sincerely hope we will meet either in person, somewhere on a demonstration or a talk or a sit-in, or via the online discussions on some different topics. So thank you also to Z Network for promoting the event. And yeah, have a good night or afternoon or whatever time it is where you come from. Goodbye.
Thank you to all, and to all the people who participated.
Yeah, I learned a lot too, and it's amazing. People stayed for 2.5 hours, quite a workout. But anyway, the struggle continues. Hope people get involved. Hope this was really helpful to people, and hope we have another discussion like this in a few months or even earlier. And thanks again, Oscar, and the whole our Real Utopia. Check out Real Utopia also.